Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our Lunch and Learn event entitled Preserving Minority and Heritage Languages, the Importance for Families' Wellbeing. Before continuing, I would like to acknowledge that while we meet today on a virtual platform, Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodian of these lands and waters, and Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations, is today the home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. This event is made possible through the financial support of le Secrétariat aux relations avec les Québécois d'expression anglaise. QUESCREN also receives funding from Canadian Heritage and Concordia University. Andrea Sander is a PhD student in psychology at Concordia University. Originally from Mexico City, her research focuses on the variation in language acquisition across diverse populations, particularly bilingual and neurodiverse children. Her clinical experience in early intervention across multiple diagnoses has deepened her appreciation for high-quality research, which can lead to better clinical interventions. If you have any questions for Andrea about her presentation, you can add them anytime to the Q&A box, and we will address these questions at the Q&A period after the presentation. Also, feel free to ask questions in French as well. So now, Andrea, it is great to have you with us here today, and I am passing on the mic to you.
Thank you, Lina, and thank you everyone at QUESCREN for this wonderful opportunity. I'm very excited to be sharing this presentation today about a topic that is really near and dear to me. Let me start sharing my screen. All right, give me 1 second. Very good. All right, wait. All right, I think that should do it. Can everyone see my screen? Yes, yeah. Perfect. So again, welcome everyone to this talk. For a quick overview, today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the linguistic landscape in Quebec, because it is the context where we do our research, and also because the talk is here in Quebec. Then we'll go a little bit over the importance of raising a bilingual child, and I hope I can convince you of good reasons to raise bilingual children. Then we'll go over how we can help those children become successful bilinguals, and then we'll have time for a Q&A. I've also prepared some frequently asked questions that we frequently get from families about bilingualism, in case we have extra time or you're shy with your questions. All right. Some disclaimers. I have some video examples in my talk. A lot of the examples are from Spanish, English, French, and Mandarin, because that's what I have access to. All the videos come from my wonderful multilingual family, who all have agreed and gave permission for showing these videos. So let's get right to it. The linguistic landscape of Quebec. Complicated, wonderful, excellent for conducting language research. The official language in Quebec, as many of you may know, is French. And there's other less spoken languages that are not the official languages of Quebec, which in this talk I'm gonna refer to as heritage or minority languages. And there's also this little hybrid in between that we like to call English, which is a widely spoken language in Quebec, but is no longer the official language in Quebec. So what are the consequences of this? French, as the official language of Quebec, is the language of all government services. It's also the main language of education, and it is a widely spoken language in services and, you know, out in the open when you go shopping in the mall or go out with friends at a restaurant. For other less spoken languages, for heritage languages, the languages are mostly spoken inside people's homes or inside their small communities, but those languages are not the languages of services or education, or they're not frequently found. Like a shop owner or a cashier is not necessarily going to speak any of these heritage languages. And again, we have our hybrid English, which is not the official language, so the government services are not really offered in English, except for certain exceptions. But you can still find some way around to getting education in English, and it is again very widely spoken in context outside of the home, like malls, restaurants, etc. Now, after hearing me talk about these, some people might be wondering, well, if French is really the official language and like the job opportunities are in French and the government services are in French, shouldn't I focus on really making sure that my child is learning French very well, instead of focusing on my child growing up hearing 2 or more languages? But if you're raising a child who's bilingual, you're not alone. A lot of people in Canada raise bilingual children. In some provinces, even up to 29% of families are raising bilingual children. And in Quebec, around 17% of families are raising bilingual children. And that number goes even higher up in big cities, where up to 25% of families are raising children with 2 or more languages. Now, let's talk about why these families raise bilingual children, and why, if your family, especially if your family speaks a minority or heritage language, why you should really consider raising your child bilingually. You might have heard that there are some developmental or brain advantages to raising bilingual children. And you might be surprised to hear that the evidence is kind of not super clear on that. We're not extremely sure that this is the case. But the evidence that is available does point to the fact that bilingual children may have some advantages in their development of attention, especially in their ability to switch attention between tasks and to be flexible in the way they think. And this is because bilinguals need to learn from very early on to be flexible, to switch around between languages and to pay attention to different cues in language switching, which may kind of be a sort of training in attention inadvertently. And there's also some evidence that bilingual children might develop some abilities to be better tuned to people's social cues. And this is again because bilinguals need to learn who speaks which language and which language you're supposed to use with which person. And this can be translated to other social cues because you have to be so attuned to people's needs. And there's also some research showing that bilinguals might be a bit more tolerant of racial differences because probably they get exposed to a lot of diversity in language and therefore also in racial populations. But today, I really want to focus on the overwhelming evidence of the social advantages of raising bilingual children, particularly of preserving heritage and minority languages. Heritage languages, for a child to speak a heritage language, it allows the child to emotionally connect with all the members of their family. So imagine being a parent who is trying to force themselves to speak a language they're not very good at, and that they don't have a lot of vocabulary in, and that they're not really comfortable speaking. And most importantly, that they don't have an emotional connection with because it's not their main language, it's not their mother tongue. Imagine all the effort that you need to put into that and the little space in your cognition that is left to build an emotional connection to the child, to be attuned to the child's needs, emotional cues. So in this video, you can see a grandma playing with her grandson, and you can't hear the audio, but she's speaking in Spanish, and you can just see how comfortable she is and the emotional connection that she's building with her grandson just because she's being able to speak the language that she's comfortable with. Bilingualism is also very important to build multi-generational connections. So there is overwhelming evidence that children being able to connect and communicate with different members of their family, not just their immediate family, but their grandparents, their cousins, their aunts and uncles, is really good for the child's mental well-being and development of self-esteem and identity. Imagine being a child going to a family reunion and not being able to play or talk with some members of your family because you don't know the language that they know. And imagine how isolating that would feel. In contrast, imagine knowing the songs and traditions and legends of your own culture and being able to participate in them, and how unifying that would feel and how good that would be for your self-esteem and family connection. For example, in this video, you can see grandma again playing with her granddaughter and dancing Macarena, which is a song in Spanish, and just singing together and dancing and building that emotional connection. Finally, bilingualism is also important to bring children in touch with their cultural heritage. We have long known language as a bridge to our cultural traditions. And it is also well researched that when children grow up in touch with their cultural traditions, when they grow up, they are better at being able to self-determine. That means that they're able to see themselves or choose for themselves which community or communities they are part of. And we know that self-determination is very important for mental health, and it also is associated with better success, better social connections, being more adapted. It sounds ironic, but being more adapted to the mainstream culture is just because instead of feeling that you're being forced into a mainstream culture, you feel like you have a choice. So you can self-determine that you can be part of the mainstream culture as well as your own culture. As you can see in this video, is the baby is participating in a Mexican tradition of Christmas, playing a piñata and singing the traditional songs and just being part of that cultural tradition. So I hope now I could convince you of the social advantages of becoming bilingual, especially of preserving heritage languages. And now you might be wondering, how can I help my child become a successful bilingual? There are many ways of bilingualism, but I'll talk about two of them right now. Some children who grow up exposed to more than one language might be able to understand one of their languages and also speak that language. And then they might be able to understand one of their languages, but not to speak it. We call those passive bilinguals. And then there's also the children who can understand and produce both or all of their languages. We call those active bilinguals. And in this video, there's an example of an active bilingual child, and you're gonna hear the child first speaking in French about fire, and then he's gonna switch to Spanish and he's gonna say the Spanish word for smoke, which is humo.
Attaque le feu! Attaque le feu! Attaque le côté! Attaquez le côté, non, madame!
Humo? Right, so we know that this child is a successful active bilingual because he can use both of their languages without being prompted to. He just spontaneously uses both languages, and he's comfortably using both languages in play. So we can tell that he's comfortable and can use both languages. This is the ideal situation that we want for our bilingual children, because that's really the way that we're going to reap all those benefits that I've been talking about. So building emotional connections, being in connection with multi-generational members of the family. So now we're going to talk a little bit about advice on how to help a child be an active bilingual. Now, an important thing to keep in mind is that this is a statistic from Statistics Canada from the last available census in 2011 of the languages that are preserved. And you can see that the mainstream languages or the main community languages are usually the ones that are most preserved, whereas the heritage languages are the ones, sorry, I'm gonna get a pointer real quick. The heritage languages are the ones that are most at risk of not being preserved. So what this means is that when a child becomes a passive bilingual, the language that is most likely to be spoken and understood is likely the community language. And the languages that are most likely to be lost or like just understood but not spoken are the minority or the heritage languages. So now for the meat of the talk, how to help a child become an active bilingual, and with a special focus in preserving heritage language. So we know from research that enough exposure to each language is really important for the preservation of that language. And we know that children need to hear of their waking time at least 25% in each language. Now, 25% might sound a bit abstract to you. So as an example, for a normal toddler who is usually awake around 12 hours a day, that's kind of the average, that would mean 20 hours a week of each language. And I know this still sounds a bit abstract, and I did make, with the help of my lab, a resource that we're gonna share at the end of the talk to help you put this into more concrete examples in your family. But it does tend to be that families tend to overestimate the amount of time their child is being exposed to their minority language. So when you talk to a family, they usually are, yeah, my child is gonna learn Spanish because they're spending some time with their grandparents. But when we actually sit down and make the calculations, they're usually hearing less than 20 hours of their heritage language. This means that families can make some changes to bring more of the minority language to their home. For example, a simple way to think about it is if you're gonna bring a new activity into your child's life, you're gonna buy a new book, try to default to the minority or heritage language when you can, because it's likely that your child is not getting enough of that language. Beyond getting enough exposure, we need that exposure to be quality exposure. This means that the interactions that you're building with your child in that language should be comfortable. So you should be comfortable speaking that language. You shouldn't feel forced to speak a specific language. And they should be engaging for the child. This is an example of a child reading a Mandarin book with his mom, and you're going to see that the child is very engaged.
小金鱼去哪里啦？小金鱼，
就橘子啊，
小金鱼，
这是
在这里。好，我们再翻。接下来小金鱼在哪里？
下船，
哦，在这里哦，好。
Right, so you can see that the child is engaged because he's looking at his mom, he's making eye contact, he's smiling, he's talking. So these are really the types of interactions that we're looking for language learning. There sometimes are a lot of questions about what about the child hearing both of their parents conversing in a specific language. There's not a lot of evidence on whether that has an impact on language learning or not. And also there is evidence that hearing language from TV, video games, YouTube videos is not really conducive to language learning. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. There are times to do it, but when you count those 20 hours for each language, you should default to interactions that are directly with the child, that are engaging for the child, and not overheard conversations or TV dialogues. And another important thing is to provide diverse exposure when possible. When the language transmission is put on a specific person, so only the father speaks Spanish and he's the sole provider of Spanish, that first of all puts a lot of pressure on that person. So that person needs to find a way to spend 20 hours with the child, giving good quality interactions. So when you can diversify the people or the activities that give language to that child, that can be really helpful for that parent or caregiver. And it also helps the child being able to use the language in different contexts and with different people. Because sometimes when the child associates a language with a specific person, they might be just comfortable using that language with that person, but they might have more trouble using it with other people because they're not used to it. Here's an example of a whole family who's singing traditional Mexican carols, and you can see the children are very engaged and they're getting exposure from different members of the family.
Pero mira cómo beben los peces en el río. Pero mira cómo beben los reyes nacidos.
Right. But we usually, all these talks sometimes really focus on what families can do, and I think that's really great. I think it's important. But I also wanted to bring a little bit, go a little bit further in this talk and also think about what we can do as policymakers and as educators and clinicians to support families in this journey, because a lot of the times all the pressure is on the family to search these solutions. So as a policymaker, there's not a lot of research, and of course I'm not a policy researcher, but there is some research that bringing language transmission into policy, so taking into consideration the importance of transmitting heritage languages, could be very beneficial for families. And one concrete example of that is parental leave, for example. Sometimes the father is the sole provider of a language, but the father has less parental leave or has more less leniency at work. So either the language transmission pressure is put on the mother, or the mother who doesn't maybe speak that language, so she has to be uncomfortable in her interactions, or the language is simply lost. And there's evidence from Europe, from this paper right here, that extending parental leave benefits for fathers really has a very good impact in fathers being involved in caregiving roles. Here's just a cute video of a father interacting with her daughter in just like a comfortable scenario. Oops.
For me, I need to fly right and follow my lead.
So these moments between fathers and children are also very precious, and especially if the father is the main transmitter of a language, it's really important to help families preserve that connection. And there's also the idea that you can bring spaces and resources to make activities for heritage transmission and culture transmission that could also help children be in touch with very diverse speakers of a language and can help them connect with their culture. This is an example of an event in Ottawa that was for a Mexican celebration, and you can just see this child being really proud of her heritage and being in touch with diverse speakers of her language. And you can just see that she's proud and happy to be there. And these things are like really precious just to make the space for these types of events. And finally, as a clinician or educator, I think my main takeaway is to always have updated guidelines. So, for example, to know this about the 20 hours a week importance of hearing each language, and especially to take into account that for bilingual children, their language development is not going to be equal in each language. So you can see in this graph for the dominant language, which is the most spoken language, the developmental trajectory goes really close to monolingual children. So the bilinguals are the dotted red lines. And it's a little bit behind, but it's really close. But when you see the non-dominant or the less spoken language, it's a bit slower. It doesn't mean that they're not gonna catch up, but it is a bit slower. So sometimes parents get scared that their child is not developing on pair, and when clinicians don't know, they might pressure parents to just switch to a single language without taking into account all the social and well-being benefits for the family of keeping both languages, just knowing that that second language might take a little bit more time to develop. And just also taking into account that there will be vocabulary differences, particularly as we reviewed at the start, when children just speak a particular language just at home, their vocabulary will be really tied up with home routines, like here, like a bathroom routine. They will know a lot of vocabulary for home things, but they might not have all the academic vocabulary because they're not going to school in that language. So it doesn't mean that they know less things. It just means they know different things. So just taking that into account and just help families feel at ease that their child is not behind or anything. It's just their vocabulary might be different, and there might be ways to help with that. That's it. I know it's like a lot of information packed into a 20-minute talk, but I would be happy to answer your questions or to talk about frequently asked questions. I also have some resources and at the end of the presentation, but I think we can wait after the questions and then I'll just give you all the resources. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. This was wonderful. I have to say I was listening with great interest to your presentation, and I have read your research and the research of the lab on this topic. I'm reading it from a perspective of an education researcher myself, but also from the perspective of a parent. I have a little boy at home who is growing up with a heritage language. So as a parent, I have to say there's a lot of useful information in this presentation and in your research. And I love the videos that you had included. They really put a they put a smile on my face, and I'm sure our attendees also enjoyed them too. Okay, so let me see if we have questions. I encourage everybody again to include your questions in the Q&A. And we do have a question in the chat. This is from Tino. Hi, Tino. Tino Bordonaro. Thank you, Andrea, for this important presentation. Quebec has a heritage language program, officially PILO program, Programme d'enseignement des langues d'origine. This program is offered in some of our youth sector schools, elementary and secondary. In addition to this program, how can schools support the acquisition, reinforcement of heritage languages?
Thank you, Tino. That's a really good question. I think, first of all, I think that it's wonderful to have these types of programs. I really think a very good first step would be to bring the program even to younger kids, because these first few years of education are so impactful in children's development, right? By the time that they're in elementary school, they're already 6. A lot of their language development has already happened. A lot of their emotional development has already happened. So bringing it as early as possible would be really important for families to be really able to develop these emotional connections and these language connections with children. That being said, I think just I think what has a lot of impact is just supporting families in their journeys. Like a lot of schools that have heritage language children sometimes worry about the child not being at the same level of peers in their language learning or their language use. So just and I've unfortunately heard a lot of stories about schools pressuring families to use more of the educational language. But just taking into account that the other language is also important, and just being supportive of families and understanding that children have divided knowledge in their languages, so they're not behind, and it's okay for them to seem a little behind their monolingual peers, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. We have a question from Royce Deward. Thank you, a very interesting presentation. I have two questions. The first one, can you share the map or source of the map about bilinguals in Canada with the participants in the presentation today? And second, the research that you mentioned about video not impacting language development, is that limited to young children? I am wondering because so many adolescents today say they improve their English this way.
Yes, those are both really excellent questions. The map is based on research by Schott et al. I have the reference at the end of the presentation, but they also built a really wonderful interactive map, and I don't have the link right now, but I can find it and share it with QUESCREN. I think it's a really wonderful resource. The second question is a really good question. It is research with young children, and my main research focuses on very early language learning. And it is very true that for older children and adolescents, they can get and do get a lot of exposure, especially to English, through social media and YouTube, and a lot of them learn through like playing video games and stuff like that. And that is also something that we've been discussing in our lab, an important consideration, because there are a lot of resources later on in life for learning the majority languages and the white spoken languages in the community, which is why it's so important to maybe feel okay to focus in the early years on bolstering the heritage language, because it is true that in the future there are a lot of other resources to learn those other languages. That being said, again, those are kids that have already developed language and they are building from that language and learning a new language. They're not developing language like babies and younger kids. So what is really important is that is not very good quality input in those very first years, especially considering that language is a link to emotional connection and other stuff.
Thank you, Andrea. And yes, as my colleague Anna is noting in the chat, there will be a follow-up email with the resources that were shared during the presentation today. And that email you will receive in the upcoming days. Marc Tremblay-Faulkner writes, merci beaucoup, c'était très intéressant. Je travaille au commissaire à la langue française et nous allons consulter vos travaux avec intérêt. La question du bilinguisme nous intéresse beaucoup. Donc, voilà une collaboration potentielle peut-être. Oui.
Merci beaucoup, je suis très intéressée vraiment et je pense que c'est très important et merci d'être ici.
A question from Sophie Wertheimer. Thank you very much for a great presentation. I'm curious to find out more about research that is being done with families that don't compromise a mother and a father. Are things different in families where both parents have the same gender? And what about families with single or solo parents? I am a solo mom who is successfully raising a bilingual, even trilingual child, but I don't see my situation reflected in much, if any, of the research or public discourse and resources. I'm also very fortunate to live in a very multilingual city and environment, which helps. I wonder if this would be possible were I not living in Montreal.
Those are really excellent points. And it's very true that we have a long road ahead of us to include more diversity in our research. Sometimes it comes down to the availability of recruiting these types of families. For example, in a research paper that we just published, we had interviewed about even around 200 families, And out of those 200, we unfortunately only had 8 families that were not traditionally constituted families. Some of them were same gender parents, some of them were single parents. So we unfortunately don't have enough data to really answer the questions in the fair way that they deserve to be answered. But I think you have a great point that we really do need to put a lot of effort into recruiting these types of families and making sure that the advice that we're giving does apply the same way to this type of families. I think it's a wonderful effort, and I really think it's amazing that you are putting the effort to raise your child bilingually as a solo parent. And I think, a lot of things apply maybe partially, but for example, when I was talking about diversifying exposure, in this case, you have all the pressure on yourself to make sure your child hears both languages. So obviously searching activities where the child can, parent groups, cultural activities where your child can be with other children who are in a similar situation and with other speakers of the same language could be very helpful to take some pressure of that.
Mhm. Thank you, Andrea. And just for people who would be interested, maybe parents who are attending the presentation today would be interested in participating in some future studies, how could they access those studies?
That's a really good thing that to remind me of. So my work is in the Concordia Infant Research Lab. I will share the logo at the end, but if you search us online, Concordia Infant Research Lab, we have our website where we have signups for the current studies. We actually have an ongoing study about trilingualism, which is another topic that is sometimes left out of research because trilinguals are hard to recruit and they're difficult to test because they have so many language combinations. So there's an ongoing effort to do that. So if you're interested, that would be wonderful.
Okay, great. I don't see any questions currently in the chat. Oh, there is one from Lorraine. Lorraine O'Donnell. Hi, Andrea. Have you seen if there is better minority language retention for jurisdictions with policies that support the minority languages and minority language communities, especially official minority language, especially official minority languages?
That is a very good question. I'm not extremely familiar with the research, but I have read a couple articles about the huge impact that policy has had in communities, especially in Canada, and I know some in Mexico that have made an effort to retain indigenous languages. So in indigenous communities that have an indigenous heritage language and that have implemented policies to retain that heritage language, there is a huge impact on the amount of language that children are learning in those communities when that is implemented. I wish there was more research done. But yes, I think that is the evidence does point in the direction that policy really bolsters the preservation of heritage languages.
Yeah. A question from Richard Boris. How can le centre de petite enfance or les centres de petite enfance, les CPE, contribute to heritage language learning along with French?
I love this question and I love that you're thinking about this. I think there are like many small and big things that can be done. I think hosting, family days at the center where people can bring their families and their languages and share their cultural and traditions can also help children realize that there are other children who speak heritage languages. I think some even small activities to, for example, bring vocabulary from home to the school and bring vocabulary from the school to the home, and to be able to kind of equalize the kind of vocabulary that children are learning, especially taking into account that heritage language is a lot of the times very contained into the home environment. So there might not be getting to know, I don't know, the numbers, I don't know, the colors or certain things that are more into these types of educational centers. So just helping children and families realize that, yeah, I would say just anything that tries to bridge the gap between the vocabularies and tries to invite families to be proud of their heritage language, to go to school and share their heritage language. All of these things, I think, are a huge step.
Thank you, Andrea. Actually, kind of a follow-up question from myself. From your observations, to what extent are these research findings familiar, or are teachers, for example, in primary schools or educators in daycares, to what extent are they familiar with this research and these findings? And if they're not, how would you recommend we can make it possible so that these studies reach them and inform their practice?
That is a really great question. I think I don't have a collected evidence of this, but just from observing what the kind of questions that the families come with to the lab, and just in general, I do think that there's some pervasive myths that are still seeping through a lot of clinicians and educators. For example, there's still a lot of focus being put in families using a particular language strategy to raise bilingual children. So a lot of families think that they need to use the one parent, one language for their child to successfully become bilingual. And there's not evidence at this point that supports that idea anymore. That idea actually started in the beginning of the last century, and it has evolved a lot, but there's still families feeling a lot of pressure and being pressured to use a particular family strategy, which sometimes puts families in a position where they feel like if they're not doing that, they're doing it wrong. So they're like being stressed about it. And the evidence now really points to just be the child hearing enough of each language, regardless of what strategy the family is using. So that is one of these things, and I think sometimes it takes time to trickle down from the research to the public, right? Like, because you see a lot of like social media posts being I see like mother influencers or like educators or SLPs influencers who are like, I use the one parent, one language, or I recommend this, and then that becomes widespread. So I think sometimes it just takes time to like word of mouth to get out and be like, well, we don't need to worry about this that much. I think there was a second part to your question. Can you remind me? Sorry.
Oh, yeah. How can we make those findings more easily accessible to educators and to teachers?
Yeah, I think it's difficult. I think it's just, these types of events I think are a really great step, just like trying our best to disseminate the science. As teachers, I think as clinicians, the best thing to do is try to attend these types of events, to search for connections between research centers and schools, to just like be able to stay in tune with the research. And yeah, I think it's kind of difficult, but yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you, Andrea. I have a question from Ariel Wharton. Hi, Andrea. Just curious, how much easier would it be for a person growing up not learning their heritage language to learn their language in their later years? Is there a higher success rate versus someone learning a language that isn't in their heritage or close to them? Or is there any data on this?
Yes, that's a great question. I don't know if you remember when in a portion of my talk, I said there are different types of bilingualism, and I only talked about active and passive bilinguals, but there are many other types. And what you're talking about is what we refer to as simultaneous bilinguals, which is learning both of your languages from birth, and sequential bilinguals, which is learning one of your languages after you've acquired one of them. Just being bilingual is really wonderful, no matter at what age you learn it. I will say that there are some advantages to learning both languages from early on, whenever possible. So one advantage, as I said, is that particularly if one of the caregivers only speaks a heritage language, then it will make interactions much more comfortable with the child, and it will allow the child to build an emotional connection better, like with that caregiver, because the caregiver won't be occupying, like being really stressed about speaking a particular language. There's also so you can learn a language at any time in your life. So like, don't worry about it. Like if your child didn't learn the language from birth, definitely at any point in his life or her life, they will learn the language and be very good at that language and reap the benefits of bilingualism. That there's no question about that. The only thing is, like, from very early on, children get attuned to the sounds of a language. So when a child learns a language after, and they lose this ability if they don't hear a language after around the age of 6. So if a child starts hearing a language after the age of 6, he will learn it perfectly, or she will. But the later, the most likely is that they will have an accent. That is not really important. Like, we love accents. I have an accent in, I think, every language I speak. But just that's the only evidence that it's like a different development of language, that they won't be super attuned to the language contrast, so they will have a bit of an accent. That's it.
Thank you. A question from Lorraine O'Donnell. Is there evidence that strengthening knowledge of heritage languages weakens knowledge or use of the majority language? For example, could it constitute a threat to the majority language?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's absolutely no evidence about this. As I showed, all the evidence that there is so far is that the majority languages are usually the ones that are very advantaged to be retained, because there is just so much out there, right? So the child is going to be very exposed to these majority languages. And so it would be really very hard. You would have to be a hermit for the heritage language to threaten the other language, right? Because yeah, at the end of the day, you spend a lot of time outside, a lot of time using services in the majority language. And that being said, children are completely able to learn two languages at the same time perfectly. Sometimes parents worry because children mix their languages, something I've heard referred to in Quebec as franglais. This is perfectly normal. It doesn't mean that your child is confused. It doesn't mean that your child is losing vocabulary in one language over the other. It's just a commonality of all bilinguals, where sometimes in our brains, and especially when we know the other person understands both languages, our brain finds it easy to mix languages. It's totally normal. And what else is really... you might see, as I said, like one of the languages, like one thing to take into account is that one bilingual is not two monolinguals, right? So it is true that there is, you are holding two languages in your brain. So like when you compare, like in really standardized tests, you will perform a little bit below monolinguals who only use one language, but that doesn't mean that you're not a competent bilingual. It just means that your development is different because you have two languages, but you will be a very competent user and you won't lose one language because of the other.
Great. A question from Richard Boris. Cummins and Swain, authors of professors possibly, at OEC, which is the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, show that teaching heritage language in the first few years of primary schooling and then moving to majority language teaching fostered good reading and writing skills in both L1 heritage and L2 language. So this is the primary, L1 is primary language and L2 is the secondary language. What is the status of this research now?
That is very interesting. Unfortunately, I'm not familiar with this research, but I will definitely follow up. I think it's very interesting. Because I look a little bit more in my research at the cognitive side of bilingualism, meaning how children learn language and not so much at the educational side, which I find fascinating. I'm not super familiar, but I think this is wonderful, this finding, and I will definitely look it up.
Okay, great. Andrea, I have a question going back a little bit to policy. You mentioned this in your presentation. If you could expand a little bit on that. My question has to do with how can policymakers use these findings to design family support programs that promote balanced language exposure in bilingual households?
Yes, thank you for that question. This is a topic that I'm really passionate about. As I said, I'm not a policy researcher, so take it with a pinch of salt. But I just really think that first being aware of the research is important. So like, for example, you were asking before, how can we help educators know more about the state-of-the-art research? I think the government, the policy can play a big role in this. I think it's a really powerful entity to help trickle down information. So if like teachers, if clinicians really aware of the importance of bilingualism and preserving heritage language and what's necessary for kids to become bilingual, they can they can touch on families much easier. And just also opening the space to help families. I've been talking to some parents being frustrated that there are so many like publicly free events like in libraries and other stuff where my child loves it, where they spend time like reading books with a book, like a book club or like a puppet show or like all of these things, but I can't find the same in my heritage language. So just like opening these spaces and knowing that it's so important for like other language to get this quality language time as well, I think is a good first step.
Yeah, and basically also acknowledging the plurilingual reality in which we live, especially in a place like Montreal.
Definitely, and the world is just becoming more plurilingual, right? So it's not something that's gonna go away, and it's not something that we can easily ignore, and it is something that it doesn't come to the detriment of one language to have children being able to access all their languages, and it does come as a help for their mental health, for their cognitive health, for their family health, which in the end trickles down to public health, right? Because we have a big mental health crisis, and like just having happy children and connected children and children with good self-esteem is just a good practice, I think.
For sure. Yeah, thank you. There is a follow-up question from Catherine Dima. Considering this information is of interest to both the Ministère de la Famille, in charge of CPEs, children 0 to 5-year-old, and the Ministère de l'Éducation, since preschool starts at 4 years old, are there any efforts being made to share this type of research with both ministries to align policies, to your knowledge?
I don't really, to my knowledge, know of a specific program that connects research to these types of ministers. I think it would be fantastic. I do think there is a big disconnect between what scientists are doing, what researchers are doing, and what's being shared to the public. I think some of us are really interested in bringing all this information out, but I do think that there are some bridges that are missing. To my knowledge, maybe there is a research that I'm not familiar with, but I think you bring a great point, and I really do think from both sides we should be making efforts to make sure that everyone has the information that they need to really touch on families who at the end of the day are the stakeholders in our research, because they get the benefits from our research. And yeah, so I think it's really important.
Thank you, Andrea. Well, we are going to stop it here. We are nearing the end of our event today. Thank you so much, Andrea, for being with us today and for your very engaging, wonderful presentation that was provided us with a lot of useful information and food for thought for sure, and possible future connections with research and with educators and with policymakers. I also would like to thank all of you for attending today's event, and thank you for your wonderful questions. The best way to learn about what is coming up in our programming, in QUESCREN's programming, is to sign up for our newsletter if you haven't already done that. The sign up QR code is on the screen. Or you can follow us on Facebook or LinkedIn. The handles for both are also on the screen. Our evaluation survey will appear on your browsers when you close this meeting. And in closing, again, we recognize the financial support for this event of the Secrétariat aux relations avec les Québécois d'expression anglaise and our other funders, Canadian Heritage and Concordia University. I would like also to thank my colleague, Anna Hunt, for her technical support today. It is also Anna's birthday today, so happy birthday, Anna. Thank you for all your work. And I wish you all a great rest of the afternoon, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. It was wonderful. And thank you for your very insightful questions.
Absolutely.